Okay, and we will stop after the presentation. All right, so we will go ahead and get started. So we just wanted this opportunity to, this is such a huge and really multi-layered issue. So there's so much that we could talk about here, but we're just going to kind of hit some of the high points just about the city's affordable housing crisis overall, which is also a national problem as well, the role of PHA, the Philadelphia Housing Authority, and kind of where we can go from here. So Ari, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so to get started, so there's a term that's used by the US Census Bureau and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is called being cost burden. Sorry. And so cost burden occurs when a household spends 30% or more of its income on housing costs. And this includes, this can include rent or mortgage, and also utilities, insurance, property taxes, anything that has to do with housing. And there's actually some debate about this 30% term right now. So it might, this statistic might actually be changing. But for right now, this is generally accepted to be the cost burden, 30% or more of your income on housing costs. So there are as many as 40% of households in Philadelphia that are cost burdened. And this is actually in keeping with other cities of its size as of 2018, which is the last year for which data was available. And this has actually gone down slightly over the past decade, but this is just because more higher income people have been moving in. So that's kind of the reason for that. So nationally, researchers have found that there are basically two distinct kinds of housing affordability issues that affect American cities. The first one is caused by housing prices being really high, and the second is caused by income levels being really low. And in Philadelphia, this issue is more the income being too low level. And I think most of us are aware that Philly is one of the poorest large city in the United States. So among the nation's most populous cities, none actually has a higher proportion of cost burdened households with low income than Philadelphia. And so Philadelphia's relatively low housing costs, even though rents, like compared to places like New York, are not that expensive here, a lot of residents just don't have the income needed to afford to find housing that they can afford. So this problem is really acute for renters who have incomes lower than $30,000 per year. So 88% of these low-income renters are cost burdened, and 68% are severely cost burdened, which means that they spend less, or they spend at least 50% of their income on housing. And so the city's supply of low-income units is just really not enough to meet the needs of this really large group of households. And there are nearly twice as many low-income renter households as housing they can afford. So it's a huge disparity. This does fall along racial lines, unsurprisingly. Half of all Latinx households in Philly are cost burdened. And this is the highest share among all racial groups and does reflect the high rates of poverty among Latinx communities. And among Black households, the rate is 46%, so still extremely high, and 32% among white households. 54% of the city's renters are cost burdened, so this also falls along renting and home ownership lines, and 28% of homeowners are cost burdened. So it's a pretty big discrepancy there. And renters are making up a larger and larger share of the Philadelphia housing market. And so of the growth in occupied housing units since 2009, 3/4 of those were rental units. So it's definitely a renter's city overall. And then the cost burden differs geographically as well, and it's most concentrated in Northwest and Southwest Philadelphia, where again, more Black communities are located in the city. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Philly does not exist in a vacuum, and a lot of this is indicative of a larger national problem. So especially over the past decade, federal and state funding for affordable housing has declined, which has just created a larger and larger gap between supply and demand. And we'll talk about that a little more later. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition estimates that across the country, there are only 34 units of housing for every 100 households. And then the Local Initiative Support Corporation in Philly estimates that 70,000 affordable rental units would be needed to end the affordable housing crisis in Philly. So these are really staggering numbers, clearly. Housing advocates do report that the city produces 300 units of affordable housing annually. But between 2008 and 2016, the city's stock of affordable apartments that were renting at below $800 per month dropped by 13,000 units. And also 300 units per year is really a drop in the bucket, clearly. So right now, the city's main solution to this, at least financially, is the Housing Trust Fund. And this is kind of an attempt to funnel money into housing. It was created in 2005, and it pulls in about $14 million annually. And it gets this money from an $80 to $100 charge that it puts on each deed or mortgage that is recorded. So over the past 16 years, this has become the city's primary tool for addressing affordable housing, and more than $138 million in revenue has been put aside to assist with new construction and rehabilitation efforts. And actually, you might remember that this was a ballot question this past November in 2021, and voters did vote to support an amendment to the city charter that would require an annual appropriation to this housing trust fund of 0.5% of the city's general fund appropriations. And so it's estimated that this would total around $26 million in the first year. So this is generating some extra revenue for housing. And then it's important to touch on, what happens when people can't pay their rent, and is that it leads obviously to evictions, which fuels the proportion of unhoused people and families. This also, unsurprisingly, falls along racial lines. And the ACLU reported that of the estimated 2.3 million evictions that are filed annually, the rate of those filed against Black renters is almost twice that of white renters. And obviously, of course, the pandemic has made everything worse. So nationally, about half of cost-burdened households reported that they lost income in March of 2020, and 17% reported being behind in rent. And so of the along racial lines, 11% of cost-burdened households have lost income and are behind in rent, 21% of Latinx households, and 29% of Black renters. So, so again, definitely disparities there. And there are some various nonprofit groups that are working on this issue and trying to fill the gap. Places like Habitat for Humanity, the Wells Fargo Foundation, which is helping with down payments on homes. Wells Fargo is obviously problematic itself, but there you go. And Esperanza in North Philly is working on establishing an affordable housing land trust in largely Latinx areas. So that is kind of an overview of the crisis itself. And I will now pass it to Yuan to talk about some safety issues in Philly public housing specifically.
Thanks, Beatrice. I really appreciate all of this. I'm going to be talking about 4 big categories here. The lack of enforcement being a huge problem, much of the housing stock being very old and upgrades being expensive, overcrowding, actually 5, sorry. Overcrowding has been a problem in cities for centuries. Zoning issues also contribute to the lack of affordable housing, and federal changes may help as like a potential solution. So a lot of what Beatrice was talking about is due to a lack of enforcement. Landlords are not necessarily required to have licenses, building codes are also not being enforced, etc. Philadelphia ranks higher than the national average in homes with moderate to severe physical problems, particularly in homes of low-income residents. In older cities like Philadelphia and New York, where much of the housing stock predates the Second World War, modern safety technologies have never been installed in many buildings. The duplex where the fire occurred dated to the 1920s. It did not have sprinkler systems, which are the strongest defense against home fires, and did not have fire escapes, as little housing in Philly does. Expense is the main argument for not making buildings safer. At the federal level, there are efforts to ease the burden for landlords. President Joe Biden's Build Back Better bill includes $2.75 billion in federal grants for fire and life safety upgrades. The High-Rise Fire Sprinkler Incentive Act, that is the High-Rise Fire Sprinkler Incentive Act, seeks to amend the tax code to incentivize building owners with older units to install fire suppression systems, get rid of battery-operated smoke detectors, hardwired interconnected smoke detectors that are tamper-proof and threaded through an apartment building are an obvious alternative. Many localities have laws requiring they be installed eventually, but landlords may drag their feet due to the expense. Cash-strapped housing authorities are just as prone to claim poverty, and Department of Housing and Urban Development, aka HUD, regulations allow battery-operated varieties, which led to tragedy in Philadelphia. I will kind of just pause here to acknowledge that, like, in terms of housing authorities across the country, Philadelphia is a city that has a housing authority that consistently has a stable budget. Like they have plenty of money that is not being spent or used for the betterment of like public housing and people that need public housing. Overcrowding has been a problem forever. In Philadelphia specifically, the housing authority was aware that the family in the duplex was overcrowded, but they had no alternatives to offer. The issue is one of subsidy, but it's also about what's allowed to be built. The lack of decent affordable housing, market rate or subsidized, is a problem stoked everywhere by construction requirements that mandate single family homes and parking requirements. Some solutions have been tried elsewhere. Eliminating single family zoning to allow property owners to build duplexes or triplexes has been adopted by Minneapolis and Oregon. Mandatory parking minimums, which drive up the cost of construction and housing, have been eliminated in cities like Hartford, Connecticut, and Buffalo, New York. I just want to pause and check the chat. So what are they using their funding for? Kara, that is a beautiful question. That's something that we're constantly wondering. They have the budget, they're not really spending the money. And on top of that, they have been proven to actually use funding for, they're working with private developers. The example I want to put forward is what's happening at West Park, what's happening with West Park public housing right now, where you have these 3 units that are outdated, that are potentially very unsafe, and basically they're planning on, like, the thing that gets me about the West Park issue is that they're planning on like they're relocating all of these people that lived in West Park elsewhere so that they can wow, I am like running a blank right now. Bottom line, what I'm trying to get across here is just that, like, with West Park, this is what I found to be so predatory. At first, we saw, like, when they first announced that they were going to be knocking these buildings down, it was like a big outrage from members of city council like Jamie Gauthier, who has since, like, kind of backtracked on her position with the West Park situation. But the rationale behind that was actually that, like, they're offering people within the housing, they're offering them the opportunity to become homeowners. So they're saying that, like, we'll allow you to own the place that you live if you so choose to stay. The issues I have with that, I'm a Black person, and I can say that, like, there's a history of, like, predatory loans and how that, or better, there's a history of how, like, when you put loans in the mix, or specifically loans around a house, how that becomes a barrier to accessibility. I'll also say, since my brain cut on, with West Park, the thing that got me is that they're actually knocking down 2 of the buildings and they're selling them off to private developers. Like, the land, they're selling them off to private developers, and then they're keeping one of the buildings and they're renovating it unit by unit, and they're promising those people that they're going to be able to become homeowners, which to me is like a huge red flag. I know later we're going to talk about action steps, but when I talk about the direction that I need the Housing Task Force to go in the next year, we need to be like on the ground tenant organizing, and we need to start getting folks in public housing into our space, because there's a lot that goes on in the decision making of public housing, and we personally don't need to be making decisions around what happens in public housing unless we have these folks in our space ultimately, which is why it's so important. I'm going to get back on script because I know we don't have all day, but kind of to get back into this, I was in the Philadelphia fire, the housing authority knew the family wanted to move, but the waiting list for affordable housing had been frozen since 2013. To speak a little bit to that, we know that the waiting list for public housing, does anybody have a specific number? I know that it's like thousands of people are currently on the public housing waiting list, and it doesn't really show any way of stop. Like there's no indication that like they're moving actively to cut this down in an adequate manner. But I think the last time I saw, we were at like 14,000 people that are on the public housing waiting list, but I could also be wrong and I could stand corrected. But as of 2016, only 17% of those eligible for housing vouchers were able to receive them due to inadequate federal funding. And Biden's Build Back Better bill includes funds to address affordable housing availability. The bill features a $65 billion for public housing rehabilitation. It also contains $25 billion for Section 8 vouchers, almost enough to make the program universally accessible for everyone under 30% of area median income. Who knows if Build Back Better will pass? And then I'm going to hand it over to Beatrice, who's going to take us through an overview of PHA.
Great, thank you so much, Yuan. Great. So a quick just kind of overview of PHA and then kind of a public housing altogether. So PHA, the Philadelphia Housing Authority, was established in 1937, around the same time that a lot of public housing was established. So it's organized under the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to its mandate is to develop, acquire, lease, and operate affordable housing programs for low and moderate income residents of the city of Philadelphia. It is the fourth largest public housing authority in the United States and the largest landlord in Pennsylvania. It has an operating budget of $400 million, and it provides housing assistance to 80,000 people throughout Philly, both through traditional public housing and through housing choice voucher programs, which are more traditionally known as Section 8. Even though it provides housing to 80,000 people, there are 1.5 million people in Philly. So this is just a drop in the bucket, and it's a very small portion of the city's overall housing need. And the number of properties owned by PHA continues to fall, as Yuan mentioned, because it keeps selling its properties to private developers to fund its operations, which would seem very counterintuitive, strange. And so yeah, as we mentioned, that's not a great way for a housing authority to raise money. And then, as Yuan was referencing, the waiting lists are extremely long. The numbers that I found, I'm not sure. I think these were as of maybe a couple of years ago, so they might be different. But right now, there's around 28,000 applicants on the waiting list for just conventional and scatter site housing, which is housing operated by PHA. And this list is currently closed except for seniors and special programs or special conditions. And then there are over 25,000 applicants who are on the Section 8 waiting list, which is currently closed to new applicants and has been since I think 2013. Next slide, please, Ari. Thank you. Okay, so just kind of a quick history of public housing in general into which PHA fits. So PHA, as I said, it was established in 1937, and this is around the time that public housing appears on the scene in the US during the Great Depression and New Deal era right before World War II. So the reason public housing was kind of taken over was kind of created was that the government mandated it in response to what it saw as being slums, basically because there were millions of people who were chronically out of work because of the Great Depression, and they were living in a lot of substandard, unsafe, and overcrowded housing. And so this was the government's response to kind of funnel money, create local housing authorities and funnel money into them as a way to deal with this sort of blight that they saw in this kind of overcrowded housing. So a lot of the public housing that was built in this period in Philly was used to house factory workers who came to the city to work in war production centers. And PHA's public housing construction continued for a few decades, actually, from the late 30s into the 70s. And the last kind of boost of financial support that it received was from some of the Great Society programs in the 60s under LBJ. And so the housing construction continued kind of through the 70s. But at the same time, this was sort of undercut because the federal government was also busy creating a bunch of policies that would really undermine public housing. So this included things like promoting the building of suburbs, white flight, redlining, and housing segregation. And so as a result of kind of all of those things, cities in the US became extremely segregated and also until very recently, extremely poor. And so this also really worked to create sort of a mindset that public housing and housing projects are not only kind of contain chronic poverty and concentrated poverty, but that they sort of perpetuate these problems or create these problems themselves. So that sort of mentality has sprung forth. Also, I'm sorry, Kara asked me this before I started talking. I completely forgot. I know this is a lot of information, so I just wanted to take a minute and just ask if anyone has any questions that they wanted to ask at this time before we continue. You can feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself if you would like.
Yeah, questions. I'd also be interested, like if people just have reactions and they want to share to some information that's being shared.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a lot of reactions, but I want to hear from other people.
Definitely. All right. Yes. Yeah, we can definitely send out, the slides and links, notes, and the recording afterwards. So I know it's a ton of information, so we appreciate you guys. And yeah, I'll keep moving for the sake of time, but any questions or reactions that you have, feel free to put in the chat and or raise your hand, and we can also talk about it in the larger discussion later on. Okay, so next slide, please, Barry. Thank you. Okay, so just a continuation of sort of the history of public housing. So then once the 70s came, the Nixon administration decided that the federal government should not construct any more new public housing and instead promoted market-based solutions to public assisted housing, mainly Section 8. So unlike kind of public housing that was run by the government, the Section 8 program issues vouchers to low-income tenants that they then use to go and seek housing on the private market. So then renters are capped at spending 30% of their income, and then the rest of the rent is covered by the federal government. And so these voucher programs, they're marketed as a way to create more choice for low-income renters, but they're certainly loaded with problems themselves, because what isn't? So these vouchers require people to go out and find their own housing with a timeline. And many landlords are just blatantly discriminatory and say they don't accept Section 8 vouchers, and there's no real enforcement or no way to stop landlords from doing that. Renters must also come up with the entirety of their own security deposits. The government does not help with that. And Section 8 housing comes with no guarantee of housing quality or of just cause evictions. So really no protections at all. So, and also when the government puts assistance dollars into the private rental market, it just works to keep rents high by subsidizing low-income renters. So, so it's not a great solution, as a lot of market-based solutions are not. And then as a result, so federal funding for public housing has really decreased ever since the Nixon and then definitely the Reagan era. And because there's been less and less money, there's been less money for repairs and maintenance, and the housing quality has really suffered. So right now, the main source of funding for public housing is something known as Hope 6. And this is a program that embodies the view that the reason that people remain poor is that they live with other poor people in poor communities. And so the best solution would be to create mixed income housing and move poor people to live with higher income people. And this does nothing to address, the real reasons behind poverty, such as systemic racism, lack of employment and education opportunities, mass incarceration. It just moves people around. So this has become kind of the way of doing things. And it's also kind of perpetuated this idea that that poverty is contagious, and that the best way to have people get out of poverty and have them be able to lift themselves up by their bootstraps is just by moving them to a different location and doing nothing to address any other deep-seated concerns. So under Hope 6, housing authorities are encouraged to demolish old housing projects and then redevelop them without requiring one-to-one replacement of units. So a lot of times leaving people with no place to go. And it's really, this particular funding stream has really whittled away at the national public housing stock, both in Philly and around the country, and it doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. So there is a particular instance of, I think we're running short on time, so I won't go into the Sharswood and Darrell Clark kind of incident with PHA, but I'm happy to share that if anyone is interested. So now I will pass it on to Yuan to talk about PHA's funding and its relationship to city government.
Great, thank you, Beatrice. I really appreciate you, and I appreciate putting all of this data together. So folks, I'm going to talk about PHA's funding relationship to city government, and then I'm going to go into themes of racial inequities and inefficiencies of the existing programs that are in place. So basically, the Housing Authority is almost entirely reliant upon federal dollars, but does get something in the way of rents and has a significant portfolio of investments. The PHA Board of Directors is appointed by Philadelphia's mayor and approved by City Council, and the board is responsible for hiring PHA's president and CEO. A component part of city government, even though it still operates outside of direct governance by the city. The Board of Commissioners convenes monthly public meetings to address PHA business. PHA's president and CEO reports to the board and has full responsibility for the leadership and management of all PHA operations. So it kind of begs the question, well, where does accountability occur? How do we hold folks accountable? Those are a couple of things that came up for me. I'm really interested in just taking a pause for a minute and seeing if anybody else had any ideas or any thoughts came up for you before I kind of move into the theme of racial inequities. Given that, like, while PHA is an office that is like outside of city government, the leadership in large part is decided. So we got a question from Christina. Is it our position not to support Section 8 type solutions? That was really interesting. The critique of market-based solutions like Section makes a lot of sense. On the flip side, Section 8 might be a way to help people. So Christina, I wouldn't say that it's our position not to support Section 8. I would say, like, from like a very basic point, I would need to have folks in Section 8 in my space before I made any decisions around Section 8. But I would say, like, if the inadequacies of the system are like very apparent per se, it would solely be from a data perspective. But in terms of like decision making or like what should happen as a result, I would personally like hold off on any like saying anything that would be a decision in that particular realm. Of course. But Is anyone interested in kind of diving a little bit deeper before I move in? I'm gonna give like a minute or so more and then kind of hop over. PHA's president and CEO. I say this thing and I've said it since I've gotten into my position about a year ago, is like, I look for the people that need to cry, but like, I think that when I talk about like pointing fingers at people that need to be held responsible, like PHA's president should just not be getting any sleep right now. And I think he's sleeping entirely too well. So when I talk about campaigns and like directions that we should go in, I definitely see PHA at the top of the list. But before I make any moves, I need people in public housing within my housing space, which is another reason that the direction of our work and our canvassing efforts in the 2022 year are going to be really getting those folks in our space, because PHA president cries on our behalf. It would be amazing. Anyway, so on to themes of racial inequities and the inefficiencies of existing programs. So basically 2019, Black Philadelphians made up 44% of the city's population, but represented 79% of people served in housing crisis and assistance programs. And furthermore, we know these services often fail to reach those most in need. So the true disparity is likely even more astounding. Inequalities in rates of poverty demonstrate how much poverty is a systemic issue and not a personal failure. 1/4 of Philadelphians live in households with income below the poverty line. Black Philadelphians are still about twice as likely to live in poverty as white Philadelphians, with poverty highest in North and West Philly. For Black children, the poverty rate was 38% in 2018. In comparison, the poverty rate for white children was 15.9%. For Black Philadelphians overall, the rate was 29.4%. Now, I did want to pause and just acknowledge that, like, the rental assistance program that has been kind of put in place since the start of the pandemic, they've actually been putting in demographic data. I have a few critiques because it doesn't really consider the undocumented folks that have been receiving rental assistance per se, and the numbers are kind of off in that realm. But I will say, with the data that has been reported, it shows that overwhelmingly Black women were the largest group to receive and to apply for rental assistance in the city of Philadelphia. I will say also on top of that, just for me, like, I think that the identifier for that and what I would like to kind of dive into is to figure out if it's Black women, but specifically Black single mothers. Like, that's the group that I think I need some sort of data representation to back up the assumption that I'm making, because the assumption I'm making is that it's overwhelmingly Black single mothers that we're applying for rental assistance. And I'm working right now to figure out the organizations and the community orgs that have been assisting folks with that. But kind of moving on, housing is one critical area where the disparity in poverty rates play out both for home ownership and for renting. Black mortgage applicants in Philadelphia were nearly 3 times more likely to be denied by lenders than white applicants in 2020. Factors in this discriminatory practice include unfair credit checks, the drastic increase in housing prices, and chronic underinvestment in neighborhoods with majority people of color. Again, I'm going to pause here just to acknowledge that, like, Philadelphia is a city with, like, I would say, in comparison to other major cities in the United States, Philadelphia has a high rate of Black homeowners, but in the same breath, I would say those Black homeowners live with salaries that are at a rate of, $30,000 a year. I'm gonna pull that data and I'll make sure to send it out. But this is a conversation that I had just engaged in, that we have Black homeowners in the city of Philadelphia, but when it comes to poverty, like, folks still live in poverty. That's something that has to be acknowledged alongside this. So renters are impacted by discrimination at least as much as would be homeowners. Although Black Philadelphians make up less than half of the city's renters, about 45%, 2 in 3 eviction cases were against Black tenants, according to the Philadelphia-based redevelopment nonprofit. Oops, sorry, Roman, I just scared my dog. White renters make up 1/3 of the city's tenants, but 17% of defendants in eviction cases. Evictions filed, even when they don't go through, can still harm people's ability to find quality housing for years after the fact. Some of these systemic injustices have a long history. The legacy of single-family zoning continues to exhibit a racialized impact in Philadelphia. City council members have been reluctant to upzone commercial corridors in the city's fastest growing neighborhoods, despite recommendations by our city's planning commission to phase out single-family zoning in areas with increasing real estate prices. The result has been rampant gentrification and displacement of long-time, low-income residents who are priced out of their homes and unable to move elsewhere in the city due to low housing supply. The history of redlining also continues to have effects today. Redlining refers to a discriminatory practice in which services are withheld from potential customers who reside in neighborhoods classified as hazardous to investment. These residents largely belong to racial and ethnic minorities. This happened to an extreme degree in the early to mid 20th century. And we have an image to show you that depicts this just as well. Due to redlining and other discriminatory housing practices, Philadelphia continues to remain one of the most segregated large cities in the US. Among the 30 biggest US cities, Philadelphia is second only to Chicago in its level of residential segregation between Black and white residents. Between Hispanic and white residents, it's the sixth most segregated. I will say, I recall seeing this chart from an Inquirer article on the matter, and this, oh wow, well, I'm not presenter, but I would say in the top left corner, there is an area in the top, what is that, northwest Philadelphia, that yes, you can just like circle that whole area where like segregation is very dramatic. You can move from one neighborhood to the next and you can see the difference and the level of investment versus disinvestment that is so apparent. And I'm going to pass it over to Ari, who's going to lead us through some action steps and an overview of the work the Housing Task Force is doing and how you folks can get involved. Yes, Kara, thank you for sharing the Inquirer article.
Yeah, that is the article I pulled that image from, so good call. Yeah, thank you so much, Yuan and Beatrice. Like, I feel like I've learned so much listening to you both and helping with the research for this. So I hope that everyone, here today has also learned some really fascinating and upsetting facts from this. I know it can feel like very discouraging to consider these struggles, and that like even after such a long time of the fight for equality, that we still have such a long way to go. But the only way to fight back is to work together and to lean on one another when we feel heavy from all of this. So if the struggle for housing as a human right is one that you would like to get involved in, one way to get involved in that fight is through our Housing Task Force. Kara, I think you have the link. If not, I can share it in the chat for signing up for the Housing Task Force updates. There are a lot of specific ways that you can get involved with our task force. So we have usually monthly meetings on the last Thursday of each month. This week is kind of different. We were kind of working with the neighborhood group for this event. But typically the last Thursday of each month, not tomorrow. We are one of our biggest campaigns that we're kind of finding a direction for right now for going into this next year is the Tenants Bill of Rights campaign. Last fall, we did knock on doors and we were listening to learn about the housing struggles that people are experiencing here in Philly and the changes that they want to see. So right now we're really kind of trying to hear from more voices, first of all, and to then put that into kind of formalizing our housing platform a little bit more to really know what our demands are, especially given the voices of people who have like the most stake in this fight. We do have several, let me go to the next slide here. We do have several working groups that are some particular ways you can get involved depending on like the skills that you might want to bring. Our political education team basically shapes like content, kind of like this, that, whether it's events, we had like from Philly to Berlin in January, or I think it was January. Time is meaningless now. But it was a really awesome event. We got to hear from some housing organizers in Berlin. And so events like that, but also they're wanting to work on putting out some content that's like publicly available for people to learn more about housing issues in Philly. We also have the policy research team. This is a great team if you're interested in some more like behind the scenes type of work. We really want to make sure that we're understanding the power structures and all the things that are going on when it comes to housing here in the city. It's kind of like a project-based group, and it's a great opportunity if you're interested in research or more behind the scenes type of involvement. I'm newly the member leader, so I'm kind of just starting to work on a member and one-on-one team of people who can kind of build out our capacity for relationship building. Since we do relational organizing through Reclaim, it's really important that we, grow our base and that we like maintain these connections with our members. So I, as one person, and you on as one person, cannot, reach out to hundreds of people regularly and maintain those relationships. So we definitely want more people who are interested in that space as well. Did you have something you on?
Yeah, I'm just gonna add to that and say like it kind of all comes together. Like when I think of like the direction of our work in the next 5 years, I see a tenants bill of rights as like the finish line, like where we get a bill in front of city council and city council passes that bill and then the tenants bill of rights is in place. But that is on an island, distant, far, far away, and we're building the roadblocks to get there. And a very basic step that we need to really work on here in the Housing Task Force, and something that we need hands on, is building out a housing platform. What unites us, one, and two, how do we define housing justice? Because right now, I'm noticing in a lot of organizing spaces, there's like this thing where terminology is used and there isn't a lot of weight put behind it. And I think it would be really important to just, from a basic level, have an understanding of what we define as housing justice, and then kind of moving forward from there. I'll say like with the political education team, they're really, Lauren Parker is leading our team right now, and they're really working through like a sort of curriculum, I guess I would say, that emphasizes what do folks need to know, and then how are the systems failing us in the way that they do. For the policy research team, one interesting project that they're working on is city council letter grades. Where do city council members stand on housing? Like we're really working through that to give them a letter grade, and that's going to have a really big impact as we head into elections for the 2023 year. So if that's something that folks are interested in, I think you should definitely take part. And then in terms of the member team, I know Ari could really use some help with one-on-oneing folks. I'll say that as the year kind of started, I sent out an email to the whole housing list, and I kind of had a lot of people set up one-on-ones with me, and I had a lot of very valuable conversations. But I'll say an overwhelming amount of those people were, they worked in some capacity with housing organizations here in the city or within city government, and they're very discontent with the way that the work is going. I think that was very like telling per se, but really getting all of those folks in a space would be incredibly valuable. But for me, I came into this space where Reclaim had already built up a base around 200, 300 people. And I think what's important for me this year is to really get an idea of who's in our base, while also kind of building out and centering like what my interests are. Because I'm Black, I come from a single family household, and I come from a low income background. I've struggled my entire life. And personally, like I need to figure out ways that we can bring more folks that are directly impacted into our space, and so that they don't feel apprehensive. The reality is that Reclaim is overwhelmingly white in our membership base and overwhelmingly middle class. And those are not positions that I personally occupy, but that's who our base is now. And it's not to say that it's necessarily a problem, but we need to interrogate like how we change that dynamic, because Philadelphia is a city of majority Black and Latinx folks, and our movement should be reflective of that ultimately, because the white middle class folks shouldn't be deciding the direction of like public housing, if you got me. But I'll stop there. We have a lot planned for this year, and I'm really, really, really trying to get more folks in, folks that are willing to what is the phrase? They lift up the sleeves. See, look, I'm missing the words. Y'all, I know 2 languages, but like you lift up your sleeves and get to the work, because there's just so much talking that goes on in organizing spaces. If I've learned anything this last year, I'm over the talking. I'm in the action stage. I need actions, and I need folks that are willing to really get in, because I view these wins as achievable, but I don't view them as achievable with 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 people. I believe it as like a people powered movement here. Reclaim, just to close out, like Reclaim believes in, like, we know that power is like organized people or organized money. And since we don't have money, we're organizing people ultimately. And it's going to take many of us to get something like this accomplished. So that's me. Really.
Thanks so much, Yuan. No, that was like really awesome context, and like that, I love that, everything you said. So I do want to like very quickly wrap this section up, but just to be mindful of everyone's time. Just as a quick like call to action, if you already know that you want to get involved in one of these ways, feel free to go ahead and like put your email in the chat or like direct message it to me, and I would be happy to reach out to you. Or if you just want to learn more, feel free to also send me an email, and I'll put that in the chat right here. Oh, Kara already did. Thank you, Kara, for being a great chat monitor today. I also wanted to offer one other option for, since, you know, the reason that we planned this for today was the Fairmount fire that happened. If you are looking for a more direct way to provide aid to the survivors of that fire, the Inquirer has compiled a list of links and resources. I think Kara has that link, yep, as well. So that those are some specific ways that you can help out as far as that event. I had I don't know if we really have time for a lot of questions. If you have questions, put them in the chat, or feel free to reach out to one of us. And sorry, this is a new slide thing. We don't really have time to come off mute for this, but if everyone could put maybe like one new thing you learned today, or just something you found really interesting in the chat, that would be awesome. And we'll send these slides if you want to look at any of these for more information. I'm going to pass it over to Kara now.
I was thinking, and my co-leaders can veto this, but since we do only have like 15 minutes left in our meeting, maybe we can just like see if people want to share something that they learned, or reactions that they have, or questions that they have moving forward, rather than doing our next breakouts. But I'm really interested in just hearing what people's reactions are. And I'm especially interested, like, has this provided you with any sort of additional clarification or like direction regarding, you know, what happened in our neighborhood? So yeah, I mean, I'm just interested. I'll give people some time. Oh yeah, and Beatrice is going to stop the recording, so feel free to be